This is a brief policy analysis of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 protects American citizens and residents from discrimination based on certain protected classes, including race, gender, disability, ethnicity, and others, while engaging in the activities related to housing. Activities could be purchasing, selling, renting, and also include activities such as financing and receiving information from realtors and property owners. The Fair Housing Act is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, a follow-up legislative effort to expand the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 1968 Act included not only fair housing, but also expanded rights for Native Americans, as well as the beginnings of a hate crimes policy. The 1960s was an era of substantial progressive social reform, and the Civil Rights Act brought about legislation that guaranteed equal voting rights, equal opportunity employment, and reinforced the effort toward racial desegregation in the United States. Ensuring compliance with the Fair Housing Act falls under the purview of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and specifically the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, or FHEO. What we think of as typical house purchasing, financing, and mortgage insurance were created in 1934 by the National Housing Act, signed by President Roosevelt as part of the New Deal legislative package. The National Housing Act created the modern low down payment 30-year mortgage financing model, and it also channeled funds into the building and construction trades to halt the downward slide of that sector as a result of the Great Depression. Importantly, the National Housing Act placed the federal government as the insurer of home loans, which gave lenders more opportunity to lend and stimulate the economy. Although successful, critics of early housing policy like the National Housing Act note that federal policies either condoned or intentionally supported numerous discriminatory acts. Racist policy surrounding appraisal, lending, and mortgage insurance, and slum clearance programs blocked minorities from participation in new housing opportunities, destroyed housing they could access, and channeled almost all of the economic growth to white homeowners, businesses, and communities. The late 1950s and 1960s were a period of substantial social unrest and dislocation, with the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and significant civil unrest occurring. The Kennedy administration, and later the Johnson administration, would begin taking steps towards social reform packages that could help restore order and advance their agendas. Fair housing as a federal policy began with President Kennedy's Executive Order 11063, which guaranteed fair housing and non-discrimination in the leasing and sale of properties that were federally owned or received federal funding. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, fair housing law still applied only to federally funded or federally owned accommodations. President Johnson, however, wanted to expand that to include all housing and pushed for that in a follow-up legislation. The new act struggled to pass, blocked in both 1966 and 1967. It was not until the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 and the explosion of rioting and urban conflict that followed that sufficient weight of events and political pressure would combine to push the Civil Rights Act of 1968 through and into law. The Fair Housing Act itself had two manifest goals. First, to protect individuals from discrimination in housing and housing activities based on various protected classes. And second, to reduce the stark racial segregation of American neighborhoods and communities. Expectations of the act were to encourage minorities to move into white neighborhoods, to balance the racial composition of urban areas, to reduce the potential for more urban rioting, and to tap growing economic potential in the African American population. Socially, the Fair Housing Act exists to protect all people from discriminatory practices in housing-related activities. It's important to understand that in the context of the times, the primary minority group of concern for policymakers was African Americans. The legacy of slavery has had a profound impact on the phenomenon of segregation and housing inequality in the United States. After the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, true equality for African Americans still remained elusive. In the South, the enactment of Jim Crow laws sought to undo any political or economic gain made by African Americans, to preserve Southern economic structures, and to reinforce white supremacy. In response, the Great Migration, an exodus of African Americans to urban areas in the northern United States, started in the late 1800s and continued through the early third of the 20th century. However, Northern prejudice against African Americans was likewise strong, and those who migrated to northern urban centers were channeled through various means into highly segregated and impoverished urban ghettos. The boundaries of these were initially enforced by violence, and when that became self-defeating for white communities, by law, covenant, and practices that ensured ongoing segregation. Extreme segregation reinforced social constructions of African American identity and stereotypes. Urban ghettos were perceived as hotbeds of criminal activity, gang activity. Residents were also perceived as being in those communities because they chose to be or because of personal failures that made them economically unable to leave. Researchers note, too, that the problems associated with segregated high poverty areas are often conflated with the racial identity of the residents, even though that link is empirically unfounded. Being segregated into poor communities also has a significant negative impact on life chances. In 2015, researchers found that moving from high poverty to low poverty areas alone had a major positive impact on lifetime income, college attendance rates, marriage rates, and teen pregnancy rates. Finally, as African Americans were being channeled into urban ghettos, European whites were leaving ethnic enclaves in the city and assimilating into a new white identity in the American suburbs. From an economic standpoint, the main engine for wealth creation and transfer in the United States, for the typical citizen at least, is through home ownership. Homes are generally the most valuable asset a citizen owns and the chief contributor to their net worth. As a result, federal housing policy cannot help but have a significant impact on wealth creation. Macroeconomically, federal policy can stimulate major industrial sectors and major economic sectors. We see that with the National Housing Act of 1934, which revitalized the housing industry after the Great Depression. At the micro level, when individuals get financing and buy a home, that money flows into the local community. Purchasing the home and the services associated with home ownership stimulate the local area. Owning a home and living in a location boosts the tax base of that area, and tax credits and expenditures, as they are realized, boost the property values in the region. Finally, you can tap your home as an asset to support further wealth generating opportunity, like funding your children's college education. There are two major stakeholders that I'll address with regard to this policy. First, there are the individuals who are homeowners or wish to become homeowners. African Americans and white Americans are separated by a stark wealth gap. Economists suggest that can be accounted for almost entirely by the disparate opportunity for homeownership that has been the legacy of American segregation. The Fair Housing Act would ideally correct for that disparity and channel more funds into the economy as minorities gained access to the engine of wealth generation that is home ownership. On the other hand, white homeowners feared a loss of economic power and property value if racial integration occurred. Responses among those neighborhoods included things like neighborhood covenants against selling property to African Americans or threats to move out if integrations occur. That economic power of home ownership is realized even today when neighborhoods that are facing integration of, say, school districts will still see white residents threaten to leave and thus destroy the tax base of the community. The other stakeholder, of course, is the housing and finance industry. They pursued a number of tactics to preserve value and to avoid investment in places they considered undesirable. They used redlining, which would mark certain areas as uninsurable. Those areas were typically minority and African American communities. They used block busting, where they leveraged the fear of integration and racial prejudices to encourage white residents to sell cheaply, thus enabling the industry to scoop up property at a very low price. They also used urban renewal to destroy African American neighborhoods that appeared to expand or encroach on high value wealthy districts. From the political viewpoint, the Fair Housing Act was part of a sweeping social reform effort, the Great Society Initiative, that aimed to aid the underprivileged, bring equity to education, eliminate poverty, and usher in many other progressive social reforms. The act had a difficult road to passage. In general, civil rights legislation had been supported by Northern liberal politicians and opposed by Southern Democrats, who were generally anti-civil rights in all of their positions. However, fair housing itself had the potential to have close, immediate effects on individuals. That is, it was one thing to support a more distant set of civil rights laws, but fair housing held the potential for the people moving into the house next door to you to not be members of your race. Walter Mondale, then a senator, called this, quote, civil rights getting personal. Because of this, Northern liberal Democrats found themselves under pressure to oppose fair housing because of their constituencies. This placed them, perhaps unwillingly, on the side of Southern Democrats, whose opposition to civil rights legislation was already well known. And for 2 years prior to passage, the combined opposition was enough to prevent the bill from moving through Congress. However, multiple events combined to push the bill toward passage. The long, hot summer of 1967 and the urban unrest and violence that occurred then was a major impetus. And Congress had to respond in some way. But importantly, in the political environment, there was a critical liberal shift in the Republican Senate that occurred after the 1966 midterms, opening the opportunity for a coalition of Northern progressives and Republicans to overcome Southern objections and pass the bill. Still, it was only with the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that enough pressure came to bear. And passage was not without compromise. Republicans, concerned about overreach and interference with the market, secured compromises on the extent of fair housing coverage, excluding primarily small landlords, and also secured changes to the enforcement powers of the Housing and Urban Development Department. When evaluating this policy, the general consensus on the policy outcome of the Fair Housing Act is mixed. The act has been largely successful in eliminating overt discrimination in housing activities. For example, one cannot advertise a property for sale to whites only anymore. On the other hand, discrimination still remains, as evidenced by continued filing of complaints with Housing and Urban Development. Studies do show some positive trends in the rate of complaints, with a decrease of 26% in complaints since the year 2008. Some analysts and critics suggest that the low action that results from complaints, however, roughly only 37% of complaints result in action, suggests that there was a defanging of the bill by removing enforcement authority from Housing and Urban Development when the bill was passed. There are others, however, that argue that enforcement through the Department of Justice is perfectly adequate. With regard to ending segregation, the consensus, however, is that the Fair Housing Act has not succeeded. Although some slow decreases in residential racial segregation are shown in studies, some of those decreases stem from African Americans moving into other non-white communities. And additionally, segregation tends to increase as the population of African Americans in metropolitan areas increases. Finally, economic inequality between neighborhoods has risen dramatically since 1970. The future of the Fair Housing Act is generally to be found in changes to guidance and rules by presidential administrations or rules issued by the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office themselves, or through legislative amendment. Legislative amendments have occurred to the law. For instance, in 1988, disability and family status were added as protected classes. And there are numerous bills in various phases of passage that seek to add additional categories to the list of protected groups.